Imagine Rome, proud of its gods, awakening under a new banner, the cross. In a single generation, millennia-old altars fell silent, and Vesta's flame seemed to yield to an invisible fire. Who ordered this eclipse? An emperor seeking heaven or control? The day of betrayal didn't begin with hammers toppling statues, but with a whisper on the battlefield and a signature that changed souls. If this story surprises you, stay. Every detail was buried beneath marble and decrees. Here, we light the lamp. You are watching Faith and Power. If you value investigations like this, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters. Now, take a deep breath. The curtain rises. Rome will never be the same. Watch. The morning over the Tiber was heavy, as if the very air refused to move. The year was 312. Two Roman forces were preparing to crash into each other like living walls. On one side, Constantine, son of Constantius, proclaimed Augustus by his troops. On the other, Maxentius, master of Rome, shielded by walls, bridges, and the confidence that the gods of the city stood at his side. The legions sharpened swords and memories. This was not merely a battle for the throne. It was a struggle for the very soul of the empire. And on the eve of the Milvian Bridge, a sign inscribed itself across the heavens. Lactantius would later write that night, Constantine dreamed of a banner bearing two intertwined letters, the chi and the rho, the first of Christ's name. Eusebius, writing years later, would record a daylight vision. Above the sun, a luminous symbol and the words, in hoc signo vinces. By this sign, you will conquer. Whatever truly happened, it was no accident. Constantine was not a man of blind faith. He had grown up in the harsh world of the frontiers, where generals trusted the blade more than prayer. The decision to paint the labarum with that Christian monogram was not merely spiritual. It was a calculated gamble. By adopting it, he was dragging into the political arena a faith that had until then been persecuted and marginalized. The legions received the banner with mixed reactions. There were veterans devoted to Mars, officers who poured wine to Jupiter before every campaign, and soldiers who, in secret, already broke the bread and shared the cup of the Christian supper. As they saw the labarum flutter, some knelt, others clenched their fists. It was as if Constantine had driven a wedge into the heart of Rome before even loosing the first arrow. The night before the battle was tense. Messengers rushed in and out, priests sacrificed animals in search of omens, and every cry from the soothsayers seemed to echo louder. According to Lactantius, Constantine ordered the new symbol to be engraved on the shields. When the sun rose, thousands of golden XPs reflected the light. It was a sea of signs never before seen in a Roman army. The Milvian Bridge became the funnel of war. Maxentius, confident in his position, stood with the river at his back, convinced that the bridge and his defenses would ensure victory. The clash was brutal. Spears rang against armor, arrows tore through the air, and the ground shook beneath the formation's weight. Slowly, Maxentius's line broke. When the bridge collapsed under the pressure of the retreat, hundreds of soldiers and Maxentius himself plunged into the Tiber. The usurper's body was later found downstream, the heavy armor dragging him to the depths. For many, the victory was proof that the new god had reached out his hand. For others, it was merely the result of military strategy and a fatal enemy mistake. But Constantine knew that, from that moment on, the official narrative would become a weapon. The symbols seen in the skies, whether vision, dream, or political construct, would be told and retold as a divine seal upon his rule. The march to Rome was triumphant, yet laden with signs of change. Instead of lavish offerings to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, Constantine gave thanks to a god with no visible temple, He ordered the restoration of Christian property, the release of prisoners condemned for their faith, and summoned bishops to advise him. The Senate and people watched with a mix of fascination and unease. Many applauded the clemency and the end of persecutions. Others whispered of betrayal against the gods who had upheld Rome for centuries. The Capitol, still adorned with statues of deities, now saw discreet crosses appear on banners and rings. Perhaps the most symbolic gesture was Constantine's refusal to participate in certain traditional rituals. With each ceremony avoided, the emperor sent a message. His power no longer flowed solely from the heritage of Romulus and Mars, but from a new alliance. And yet this was not a total or immediate conversion. Constantine continued to feature the image of Sol Invictus on coins, retained pagan titles, and understood that ruling the empire required balancing traditions. This ambiguity was his greatest weapon, and to some, his greatest hypocrisy. In the streets, rumors grew. Christians once hunted now walked without fear, some too proudly, provoking quarrels with old devotees. Pagan priests, fearing a loss of influence, multiplied omens of disaster should Rome abandon its gods. The bridge over the Tiber had been only the beginning. With one battle, Constantine had not only eliminated a rival, but also planted the cross at the heart of Roman power. The consequences, however, were yet to come. Every decree, every coin, every public gesture would now be interpreted through the lens of what had happened that misty morning. The official history would speak of divine victory. Opponents would murmur of manipulation. And the people would learn that symbols can be sharper than swords. In truth, Constantine had done more than win a war. He had given the Christian faith something it had never had before, an emperor. And with that, the line between throne and altar began to blur. What was gained in protection might one day demand a price in purity. That autumn, Rome received its new ruler under triumphal arches and applause. Few noticed that, mingled with the sound of drums, there was another sound, the distant echo of temple doors closing, of altars soon to be forgotten. The sky, which on that eve had been filled with light, now seemed to drape the city in a cloak of expectation. And so, the bridge no longer joined only two shores. It joined two worlds. Winter had not yet retreated when, in February 313, two emperors met in the city of Mediolanum, modern-day Milan. Constantine, fresh from his victory at the Milvian Bridge, and Licinius, his temporary ally, gathered to seal something that would alter the spiritual destiny of the empire. What emerged from that meeting would be called the Edict of Milan, but it was far more than a simple document. It was a redefinition of alliances, beliefs, and power. The hall where the agreement took place was heavy with the scent of Eastern incense and political tension. Guards, statues, and maps set the scene. But the subject at hand was more volatile than any border. For the first time, the empire would declare unrestricted freedom of worship. Christians, persecuted for decades, would now, in theory, receive the same rights as any citizen who honored the ancestral gods. The letter sent to governors spoke of freedom to follow whatever religion each person prefers, so that any divinity may be favorable to us. But the text contained more. Orders to return, at no cost, the properties confiscated from churches and from Christian individuals. It was a blow against those who, just years before, had profited from persecution, and a calculated gesture to win the gratitude of the newly favored community. Behind the scenes, many knew that such a concession was born not solely of compassion. Since the Milvian Bridge, Constantine had recognized the value of having at his side a disciplined, united network ready to swear loyalty. The churches, though scarred by persecution, had structures of mutual aid, capable leaders, and a narrative of endurance that inspired devotion. Licinius, for his part, accepted the agreement more out of necessity than conviction. His view of Christianity was pragmatic. It was a price to pay for an alliance against common rivals. Still, the document would bear both his and Constantine's names as guarantors of a new principle, a principle that could be read as generosity or as imperial calculation. Reactions were mixed. In cities with a strong Christian presence, there were public celebrations, improvised processions, and open-air worship. In centers of pagan tradition, the edict was met with coldness or silence. Ancient priests saw in the text a veiled threat. Equality of rights was, for many, only the first step toward the supremacy of one creed over all others. In the imperial archives, the edict's copy rested between military treaties and tax decrees. That detail said much. For Constantine, religion was also a matter of state. By protecting Christians, he not only neutralized a source of internal unrest, but also won allies in the East, where the faith already had deep roots. And yet the application of tolerance would not be uniform. In regions governed by hostile officials, the return of properties was slow, often sabotaged. Some Christian temples remained in ruins despite imperial orders for their restoration. Meanwhile, pagan communities began to feel a subtle displacement. Positions, once held by them, were now offered to Christians trusted by the emperor. In Constantine's council, bishops began to occupy informal seats, influencing decisions on taxes, public works, and appointments. The throne was becoming accustomed to the murmur of psalms mingled with the clinking of coins. The emperor's diplomacy extended beyond the frontiers. Messages were sent to barbarian leaders, emphasizing that Rome now protected the one God, subtly suggesting that this new faith was tied to the same military power that had toppled Maxentius. The association did not go unnoticed. Christians saw in it the hand of God guiding the imperial sword. Skeptics saw only clever propaganda. The coins minted in the following years reveal Constantine's duality. On one side, Sol Invictus still shone, a symbol of continuity with past traditions. On the other, discreet inscriptions began hinting at victory by divine will, an ambiguity that kept old allies close while preparing the ground for more radical changes. The Edict of Milan also exposed a tension within the Christians themselves. Some were wary of imperial closeness, fearing that freedom would come with strings attached. Until then, the Church had survived without depending on Caesar's favor. Now, the hand offering protection was the same hand that could shape doctrines and settle disputes. Ordinary people noticed changes in daily life. Where once night gatherings were monitored, basilicas now rose with official support. Widows and orphans received aid from Christian communities more freely, and pilgrims traveled without fear of arrest simply for professing their faith. Yet there was also a growing sense that something else was at stake, an invisible bargain between altar and throne. By year's end, Constantine reinforced his message with a symbolic gesture. He ordered the construction of churches in strategic locations, some on sites once dedicated to ancient deities. It was as if each stone were a political statement. The old world was giving way to the new. For the guardians of tradition, this was the sign of an approaching storm. A state that protects can also smother. An emperor who guarantees freedom can, with a single decree, redefine it. The Edict of Milan, celebrated as a milestone of tolerance, also planted the seeds of a future in which only one faith would be allowed. Constantine knew that patience was as important as strength. He allowed the edict to be interpreted differently in different places while consolidating his power. On paper, all cults had equal rights. In practice, the scales were beginning to tip. The meeting in Mediolanum ended with banquets, toasts, and promises of eternal friendship between the two Augusti. Just a few years later, they would face each other in open war, and Christianity would remain a central piece in the alliances and justifications on both sides. For now, however, the document, circulated, bearing the signatures of two men who saw faith not as mere devotion, but as a tool of governance, The tolerance they proclaimed was both shield and sword, and as the scrolls were copied and sent to the provinces, the empire was beginning to grow accustomed to a new idea. Rome could change its gods without losing its name. But no one could be certain whether in the future this exchange would bring peace or another war. Messengers galloped along the imperial roads carrying invitations that sounded more like commands. In Nicaea, in the summer of 325, the bishops would decide which Christ Rome would serve. This was not only theology, it was political gunpowder. From Alexandria, the dispute stirred up by Arius had set letters, pulpits, and taverns ablaze, proclaiming that the Son was sublime yet created. On the other side, Athanasius and his allies defended a sonship without beginning, light from the same light. Constantine, weary of doctrinal fires, summoned everyone to a council that would also serve as a tribunal. He wanted peace, unity, obedience. Above all, he wanted to keep the empire from tearing its own skin. Nicaea breathed heat and dust. The palace prepared on the shores of Lake Ascania welcomed men whose bodies bore the scars of the last persecution. Some arrived limping, others showed empty eye sockets, burned by iron. When the emperor entered, robed in purple and gold, he carried no sword, but the authority of one who could exile or honor with a gesture. The bishops rose. There was the silence of a courtroom and the murmur of a marketplace. Here they debated the word that would divide orthodoxy from heresy, homoousios, of the same substance, a term not found in the Gospels, yet one that promised to shield the heart of the faith from calculated mortal risks. Arius spoke with a musician's cadence in his voice. He sang formulas polished for the people, repeating that the Father is ineffable and the Son his perfect work. If there was a time when God was alone, he said, there was also a beginning for the Word. Some bishops pounded the table. Others called for calm. Athanasius, still a deacon, replied like a blade. If the Son is a creature, he cannot save what he does not share. Salvation demands that God descend without ceasing to be who he is. The emperor watched, fingers tapping. The armrest, weighing each outburst, fearing the dispute could set entire provinces aflame that very year. Not everyone sought truth by the same road. Eusebius of Nicomedia moved through the corridors as one who knew every shadow in the palace. He spoke courteously, brokered compromises, promised peace. For him, to impose rigid formulas was to wound consciences and provoke revolts. The emperor tolerated ambiguity so long as it served the greater goal, unity. Letters arrived from the court, reminding of names, favors, debts. Some prelates pleaded for moderation. Others demanded exemplary condemnation. Notaries wrote everything down, turning sacred debates into state records. One ill-chosen word could shift borders, erase offices, dry up alliances. The council was a volcano ready to erupt. The day came to stitch phrases as if sealing borders. They debated verbs, prepositions, breaths. The decisive term rose like a banner, homoousios, not similar but consubstantial. Constantine favored the blade of strong meaning, advised by bishops who feared any gap. The text took shape. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made. That, for us and for our salvation, he came down from heaven. Whoever dared to dilute it would be cut off from communion. Signatures lined the parchment. Some hands trembled. A few refused, including Arius's companions. Then came the anathemas, exiles, sealed orders. Peace was born under the watch of imperial guards. Yet exiled heresies learned to breathe through cracks. Arius's hymns were banned, but many already knew them by heart. Sailors sang them at the docks. Mothers whispered the refrains to children. Merchants carried the melodies along with their cloth. The emperor demanded that bishops enforce the decisions. Some did so zealously, others reluctantly. In the East, sympathies for more cautious formulas resurfaced. Eusebius of Nicaea gained ground at court. Politics moved like the tide, bringing back once banned names. Years later, Constantine himself would draw closer to moderates and allow returns. On the horizon, a late baptism would seal ambiguities that history would never erase. The council also served as a theater of state. Lit halls, motionless guards, scrolls passing from hand to hand, red seals, chairs positioned to frame power. Episcopal liturgy met imperial choreography. When debates flared, protocol cooled tempers with carefully planned meals, gifts, and promises. Ships waited for orders on the lake. Horses stood ready to carry decisions to the provinces. Nothing was improvised. The empire had learned to turn disputes into disciplined spectacles, and those once persecuted now sat as counselors, tasting the vertigo of access. The blood of martyrs was now joined by ink, paper, and crowns. A new alliance was born there, tense and unsteady. Athanasius stood out for his quick thinking and a courage that asked no permission. A young deacon, he moved among his elders with controlled boldness. His core argument cut deep. If Christ is not fully God, our hope is theater. The faithful had not crossed arenas to follow a mere creature. The holiness of martyrdom demanded a savior equal to the Father. On the other side, Arius was no two-headed monster. He was a pastor with charisma, intent on safeguarding the majesty of God, fearing to confuse Father and Son. In this tension, souls were pulled by both convictions and friendships. The theological dispute became, for many, a lifelong inner war. When the creed was read aloud in assembly, a collective sigh was heard, not of relief but of awareness that they had stepped through a door with no return. The final lines carried anathemas like fences. Whoever says there was a time when the sun was not, let him be excluded. Fences served to protect, but also to mark enemies. The imperial seal turned conviction into law. From that day on, disputes over a single vowel could depose bishops, shift maps, and light the paper pyres of official condemnation. They had chosen clarity at a cost. The unity bought in that hall would accrue interest for decades to come. The altar had learned a legal tongue, irreversible for all time. When the ships left Nicaea, the lake kept the reflection of a decision still learning to walk. The emperor departed satisfied at having put out the fires, but he knew embers traveled hidden in the clothes of his own messengers. Bishops returned to their sees carrying scrolls, wounds, and the certainty that the faith now had an escort. Along the roads, rumors ran faster than horses. Some temples celebrated in silence, other homes lit lamps. The council had sown a new banner, and each province would wave it according to its local winds. Soon enough, another imperial hand would pen decrees to make that banner an eternal law. In the winter of 380, the winds crossing the Adriatic carried more than cold. In Thessalonica, 3 men were sealing the spiritual fate of Rome. Theodosius, newly appointed Augustus of the East, Gratian, ruler of the West, and the young Valentinian II signed a decree that would sound like a trumpet blast in the ancient world. From that day forward, Nicene Christianity would not only be permitted, it would be the only faith legitimate for anyone who wished to be called Roman. The Edict of Thessalonica spoke not of tolerance, but of obligation. The text, brief and sharp, ordered all peoples of the empire to follow the religion which the divine apostle Peter delivered to the Adiate Romans. It left no space for Arian doctrines or for any other interpretation. More than that, it labeled dissenters as foolish and demented, stripped of the name of church and of their civil rights. It was no invitation, it was a sentence. The pass. Words of Theodosius fell like a military order, and bishops knew they now had the arm of the state to carry out their decisions. The streets reacted like a cracked mirror. In Constantinople, Christian processions swelled, occupying avenues once reserved for civic parades. In pagan temples, priests felt the ground vanish beneath their feet. What had once been ancestral pride had suddenly become an illegal practice. The right to exist now depended on reciting an imposed creed. In Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome, rumors spread that guards were already attending public celebrations to ensure that nothing was said outside the approved formula. The following year brought harsher laws. In 391, Theodosius forbade any pagan sacrifice, even in private homes. Temples, if still open, would now be nothing more than empty buildings. The year after, the ban extended to any form of worship of the old gods. Altars were dismantled, statues toppled, festivals canceled. Those who dared to defy the orders were fined, exiled, and at times executed. There was no longer balance. The cross and the crown were now intertwined in an unbreakable pact. The loss was not only religious, it was cultural, political, and emotional. Each closed temple was also a guild hall, a meeting place, a library in stone. Records show letters from governors pleading for moderation, fearing revolt. Some cities pushed back. In Carthage, crowds tried to stop the removal of statues of Saturn. In Alexandria, resistance exploded at the Serapeum, the great temple dedicated to Serapis, a symbol of Egyptian-Greek syncretism. The Serapeum was more than a sanctuary. It was a cultural center, a repository of manuscripts, a symbol of identity. In 391, after violent clashes, Christian groups, encouraged by Bishop Theophilus, stormed and destroyed the temple. Columns fell, statues were smashed, and the massive idol of Serapis collapsed under hammers, scattering sacred dust across the floor. The scene was celebrated from pulpits and mourned in back alleys. For many, that day marked the visible end of the ancient world. Not all Christians rejoiced. Some remembered that the faith had been born without the sword, sustained by the blood of martyrs, not by the armed hand of the emperor. Letters from monks and theologians warned of the danger of confusing the kingdom of God with imperial decree, but the machine was in motion. Laws continued to tighten against any practice that evoked the pagan past. Even agricultural games and rituals were rewritten to exclude mention of the old gods. In the countryside, peasants adapted traditions to avoid punishment. Harvest festivals became celebrations of saints. Offerings were replaced by processions. The memory of the gods survived in disguise, whispered in songs, carved into hidden symbols inside homes. The transition was not instant, but it was inevitable. Within a generation, children would grow up never having seen sacrifices to Jupiter or dances for Ceres. The Roman Senate resisted as long as it could. Many aristocrats still declared themselves pontifices of ancient cults, using their influence to preserve rights in private estates. But Theodosius stood firm, refusing to restore. The altar of victory in the Senate, a symbol of the old civic religion. Victories now belong to one God alone. The betrayal, for the guardians of the gods, was not only the loss of worship but the manner in which it happened. The state that had once protected them now turned against them with the same fury it had once used against the Christians. The cycle of persecution had changed hands, and the memory of Nero's flames was replaced by the echo of hammers striking marble statues. For Theodosius, it was not betrayal but purification. In his letters, he argued that unity of faith was essential for unity of the empire. To fragment religion was to weaken the walls against barbarians and traitors. In the emperor's eyes, multiple gods meant multiple loyalties, and Rome could no longer allow that. The result was a peculiar silence in the cities. Public squares that had once hosted multiple cults became exclusive territories of the church. Images of saints filled niches once occupied by Mercury and Minerva. Sacred fountains were reconsecrated, temples transformed into basilicas. The landscape, changed as if a painter had applied a new color over an old mural, leaving the shadows of the past faintly beneath the surface. Some Christian historians, such as Rufinus and Socrates Scholasticus, recorded these events as victories of the gospel. Others, more cautious, acknowledged that the use of imperial power to impose the faith carried spiritual dangers, and on the margins of official history, pagan authors like Zosimus narrated the era as the beginning of Rome's decline, linking the fall of the gods to military and moral decay. The question remains, was this the day Rome betrayed its gods for the cross, or the day it found its true calling? The answer depends on the altar before which one kneels. The fact is that after Thessalonica and the laws that followed, the old pantheon was driven into the shadows. The marble that once gleamed in temples now supported churches. When Theodosius died in 395, he left behind an officially Christian empire, but one politically divided. East and West were already drifting apart, and the frontiers were pressed by peoples who recognized neither Christ nor the Senate. The cross reigned at the summit, but the foundations trembled. Rome had traded its gods. The price of that alliance would still be paid, stone by stone. The waves lapped against the docks of Alexandria, carrying rumors from every province. Temples closed, festivals erased, priests vanishing from public squares. Rome was officially Christian, yet the echo of the past refused to fall silent. In narrow alleys, amulets still bore the symbols of Isis, Mercury, and Bacchus. In aristocratic homes, ancient mosaics remained on the floors, hidden under rugs so as not to draw accusations. The empire's conversion had not been merely a change of creed, it was a forced remodeling of memory. In the heart of Alexandria, between columns that touched the sky, the Serapeum lay in ruins. Where incense once rose, charred stones now lay. The sacred space, which had housed libraries and assemblies, had been turned into a place of surveillance. Christian children were brought there to hear sermons about the fall of the false gods. The emptiness left by the temple had become a symbol of the new regime, visible, imposing, inescapable. In Rome itself, temples were baptized. The Pantheon, once the house of all gods, received a Christian altar. The marble walls remained, but their meaning was replaced. Paintings and statues were removed or altered, the ancient shapes still whispering beneath layers of plaster. In every reused stone, there was both victory and loss. The Eternal City was becoming a converted city, by force or by conviction depending on who told the story. The calendars underwent invisible surgery. Feasts, once dedicated to Janus, Mars, or Venus, were replaced by days for saints, martyrs, and Marian celebrations. Processions that had once celebrated the fertility of the fields now invoked Christian blessings on the harvest. For the people, life still followed the rhythm of the seasons, but the names had changed, and with them, the memories that had bound generations together. The Senate, still filled with men who had sworn loyalty to the old gods, saw its spiritual authority dissolve. To refuse an oath in Christ's name meant losing influence, contracts, even personal safety. Some yielded, adopting the new faith publicly while keeping private devotions. Others resisted and were expelled from public life, their properties confiscated. The political arena became a confessional space. In the barracks, the transformation was just as deep. Standards bearing Sol Invictus were retired. Legions that had sworn loyalty under the gaze of Mars now pledged their oaths beneath the sign of the cross. Preachers accompanied the troops, exhorting them before battles and reading scripture between marches. For veterans of earlier wars, the change felt strange, almost a breach of their pact with Rome itself. Among the people, the imposed conversion fostered a network of silent resistance. In remote villages, old rites survived under disguise. Offerings, to agricultural deities were rebranded as blessings to the creator god to avoid punishment. Pagan symbols were incorporated into Christian carvings, producing hybrids that escaped the notice of less discerning eyes. Christianity triumphed in law, but it still had to contend for hearts against traditions rooted over centuries. The Church, once persecuted, now faced the dilemmas of power. Bishops received lands and privileges from the emperor, but with them came political responsibilities, deciding on taxes, managing estates, mediating civil disputes. All this drew spiritual leaders into the orbit of courtly politics. Some saw in it an opportunity to shape society according to the Gospels. Others feared that constant contact with power would dilute the purity of the faith. The people noticed the change in preaching. Sermons spoke less about persevering under persecution and more about obeying the authorities. The images of the martyrs were still venerated, but now as relics of a time that should not return. The blood spilled in the arenas was invoked to justify the new order, not to question it. On the frontiers with the Germanic peoples, official conversion created new challenges. Missionaries were sent to convert tribes but met fierce resistance. Many barbarian leaders followed alternative forms of Christianity, such as Arianism, which was banned by the empire. Doctrinal disputes turned into political wars, and faith became a banner under which military campaigns were waged. The economic effects were equally clear. Wealth once allocated to the upkeep of pagan temples now funded the construction of churches and monasteries. Craftsmen adapted their skills. Idol carvers now sculpted crucifixes. Goldsmiths who had made crowns for gods now fashioned reliquaries. The transition generated work, but it also erased ancestral trades. Theodosius and his successors believed they were saving Rome from itself. By unifying faith, they hoped to strengthen the internal walls against external threats. But the rigidity of the new orthodoxy also created invisible fractures. Families split between converts and holdouts, cities divided between loyalists to the imperial creed and sympathizers of ancient traditions. Religious peace was maintained at the cost of silencing all dissent. Christian chroniclers celebrated the victory as the fulfillment of prophecy. To them, Rome was now an instrument of God, continuing the mission begun by the apostles. But in hidden manuscripts, pagan writers recorded the same period as a cultural tragedy. The destruction of temples was described as a mutilation of Rome's soul, and the imposition of a single faith as the beginning of a decline that nothing could stop. The price of conversion was paid not only by those who lost their gods, but also by those who embraced the new faith. The Church gained security and influence, but lost the isolation that, some argued, had kept it pure and resilient. The empire, for its part, gained doctrinal unity, but assumed the risk of turning theological disputes into civil wars. In 410, when Alaric's Visigoths sacked Rome, many traditionalists accused the new religion of having severed the city's ties with its protective gods. Augustine answered with his monumental City of God, arguing that the true homeland was not Rome, but the heavenly kingdom. Yet the attack shattered an illusion. Conversion had not shielded the eternal city from history. Among the ruins, crosses, and broken statues stood side by side. Children played, unaware they stood atop layers of buried worlds. Rome endured, but it was no longer the same. The price had been paid, and would continue to be paid in the centuries ahead, in disputes, reforms, and memories that would never be entirely erased. Rome traded its gods for the cross, but the exchange was neither simple nor innocent. It began as a vision in the sky, grew into a council under the emperor's watch, turned into a decree that forbade ancient altars, and ended up shaping every stone, every feast, every oath. For some, it was the spiritual salvation of the empire. For others, an irreversible betrayal of Rome's soul. What was lost was not only worship or tradition, but an entire way of thinking about the world, of relating to the divine, of telling one's own story. What was gained was doctrinal unity, political cohesion, the promise of a kingdom that did not depend on marble walls. But every alliance with power has a price, and the history of imperial Christianity reminds us that the cross, when borne by the throne, is never light. Centuries later, we still debate whether Theodosius, Constantine, and the bishops who accepted their favor saved or corrupted the faith. Perhaps Rome found under the cross a mission that would outlast it in time and space. Or perhaps it merely exchanged one pantheon for another, keeping intact the logic of ruling hearts by force. Walking through the streets of Rome today, you see basilicas rising over temples, relics preserved where bronze statues once stood. The city is a silent witness that there is no conversion without memory. Beneath the cross, the marble still whispers the names of the old gods. And here the question returns like an arrow. When faith sits on the throne, does it rule, or is it ruled? If this story has sparked your curiosity, if you want to keep exploring the thread that ties the cross to empires, don't let this be the last chapter you hear. Subscribe to Faith and Power, follow the next investigations, and join us in uncovering how faith has shaped and been shaped by the great powers of history. Because what Rome once lived, the world still repeats.